Well, the weather is deceptively nice right now. I mean, it is, just a few degrees above Celsius, but the sun's out. It's a beautiful spring day. The flowers are in bloom. Unfortunately, everyone is inside due to a quarantine. We've been under a quarantine now for about 9 days. There's some talk about doing a nationwide quarantine, and that may yet happen. There's some talk about Parliament calling an emergency session this week and introducing martial law to enforce a nationwide quarantine. But yes, Kyiv's have been under quarantine. In practical terms, it means everything's closed. No restaurants, cafes, entertainment, sports events, theaters, and so forth. On a practical level, there's pharmacies open, which is very important, obviously. People need to get their medicine still, whether or not they've been affected with coronavirus or they have other conditions. So those are remaining open. The other important thing remaining open, of course, are grocery stores. So the neighborhood producti are still open, and then you can get your Grechka and milk and all those important things. Speaking of which, I know in North America there's been talk of hoarding of toilet paper and empty shelves at Costco and Walmart and so forth. We go shopping there every couple of days here. I've not noticed that in Ukraine at this point. That may change. The only noticeable difference when I went on Saturday to buy groceries for the week was that half the people were wearing these protective masks, and which is actually a good thing. That was the only noticeable difference. But everything was stocked up: fresh fish, meat, vegetables, fruits. There seemed to be really no shortage of anything, and that's a good thing so far. There's not been a panic in Ukraine and a run on the grocery stores. The other thing that are sort of open are restaurants. Obviously, restaurants and cafes have been taking a big hit financially. However, a lot of them have switched to online ordering and delivery. So those restaurants which have been able to do deliveries are managing to create a little cash flow to stay in business. So everyone's adapting to these difficult times with quarantine. Well, just to clarify, restaurants and cafes are closed to the public, but you can order food and then they will deliver it to your home. Also, and very importantly, government buildings, for the most part, are remaining open. Precautions are being taken, of course, but there are some obviously essential government services that must continue at this time. Some unnecessary, maybe, or not unnecessary, but less necessary, less urgent government service offices are closed. For example, for me as a foreigner, I have a residency permit, and the State Migration Service announced that for foreigners who overstay their 90 days in Ukraine, that they will not be fined due to the quarantine. Now I have my residency permit; it doesn't apply to me, but for a lot of people who are here, that has been an issue when they've stayed longer than 90 days or 180 days in a year's time. Yeah, I would say it was ironically Friday the 13th. At 3 o'clock that day, Kyiv time, they announced that they would be closing the border for foreigners, for non-Ukrainian citizens. And those with, residency permits would obviously be able to stay. But the basic message was, if you leave Ukraine, do not expect to get back in. And those who want to come to Ukraine, they have 48 hours to get to Ukraine. So that was ironically the period of time when I knew this is going to be a longer time period of potential quarantine and adapted life due to this virus. Well, with regard to the health ministry, it's actually quite a fluid situation. As of yesterday, Ilya Yemets, who was appointed just recently with this new cabinet, took over for Zoryana Skaletska. He's been on the job less than a month, and there are already reports coming out from influential members of parliament in the Sluha Narodna faction, the Servant of the People faction, the ruling faction, that he'll be quitting. So if that turns out to be true, that would be the second health minister now in 6 months that has not survived. So, in troubled times, people are looking for people who are tough managers, who can get results, who are not worried about PR, who are simply out there to do an effective job. And in this case, there have been calls, particularly on social media here in the last 48 hours, for the government to put aside their differences and their egos aside and to put Dr. Uliana Suprun back at the Ministry of Health. She has always stressed that healthcare is a national security issue, and she could not be more right in Ukraine, in the United States, in Canada, than right now. Healthcare is definitely a national security issue, and these troubled times, a proven manager and Ukraine's longest serving health minister in its history, Dr. Ulyana Suprun, would be a welcome face both to the international community and the Ukrainian community during this time of possible epidemic. I mean, the best estimate, they say the most optimistic estimate, is that the GDP would take a 5% hit this year. That's the most optimistic estimate. Whereas before, if you go back to New Year's, then Prime Minister Goncharuk was talking about we're going to grow the GDP by 40% over the next 5 years. We're going to do all this free market stuff with the economy. It's, the thing is, if that had happened, people would be kind of echoing his Ayn Rand style rhetoric and, asking who's John Galt. The thing is now, though, a few months from now, people are going to be asking who's Alexei Goncharenko, because he quickly appeared and disappeared, and his economic forecasts obviously are not going to be met due to this virus. What's going to be the economic effect? We don't know. Already, though, according to the American Chamber of Commerce survey of all its members, 62% of businesses that are members of the chamber that took part in the survey are saying that they will not meet their expectations for this year. What they had planned to do for 2020, they're not going to be able to do it. This hits particularly hard on small business, obviously, and entrepreneurs. So that is a big warning sign. Another 23%, 24% of the survey respondents also said that they're likely going to have to lay people off. So that is also going to just, spiral the economy downward. So we don't know how bad it's going to be yet, but for sure, there's going to be cuts across the board. And as always, we're hoping for the best, but Ukraine is part of the global economy. And what happens in Europe, what happens in America, obviously, and Canada is going to affect that. Canada has a free trade agreement with Ukraine, as does the European Union. So, those markets are getting hit hard, particularly Europe right now. We'll see what happens there. Hope for the best. The biggest issue, of course, right now in the short term is, those who are interested in investing in Ukraine are going to have to do it over the internet, because if you're not already in Ukraine as a foreigner, you're not going to be able to get in for at least the current period of time. There's some talk about renewed flights out of Ukraine on April the 4th, although the last flight from Kyiv to New York takes place tomorrow. So, flight service is cut off. Foreigners are not allowed to enter the country right now. So if you're a foreigner looking to invest, now's the good time to do research, talk to those who are in country, get good advice, talk to lawyers, talk to your embassies and so forth. In the interim term, I mean, this is not going to last forever. In the middle of battle, both sides think the day is lost. It's the side that pushes forward and gets the job done. It's going to win the day. And that's no difference with this virus situation. In the intermediate term, say a few months out, 3-6 months, when the quarantine is over, life resumes some normalcy. We'll have to pick up the pieces of the economic effect and what it's done to Ukraine. At the same time, though, that will lower some prices. Lower some prices on some of these planned privatizations. So there'll definitely be some opportunities in Ukraine. The parliament still has to pass the land reform, the land privatization in the second reading. And even though that's not going to open up the land market to foreigners for at least 5 years, it will open up the domestic market. And that in and of itself will add to the GDP. So it will reduce the damage to the GDP. Now, frankly, is the time to do that, because it is one of the requirements that the International Monetary Fund has insisted upon with Ukraine. That and also protecting the bank from its Privat bank from its former owners, Mr. Kolomoisky. But now is the time to get that land reform and land privatization passed, because that's the only thing that's ultimately going to jumpstart this economy after the effects of this virus. $4 billion of debt is due to be repaid between April and December this year. Now, Ukraine has $25 billion in reserves at this current time, which is a record high. It actually was 26, but they had to spend $1 billion in the last week to keep the currency from sliding too much. The currency slid about 10-11% over the last month due to the economic situation. and concerns about getting the IMF new standby agreement. So it's now more critical than ever that Ukraine get this IMF agreement. But the IMF has actually sweetened the deal a little bit because they have announced that they are willing to add some money to the anticipated $5.5 billion agreement for Ukraine because of the effects of this coronavirus. So that could actually be good economic news as well. Now, the first step in the door through which all of this goes, though, is getting land privatization passed by Parliament and signed by the President. Without that, all the doors are closed. As someone who's done sociology in Ukraine for 20 years, I can tell you that land issues are just one issue that Ukrainians just can't get their head around in terms of accepting that this is a good idea. And again, it goes back to Ukraine's history as being a borderland, and I've done focus groups on this issue, and even highly educated master's degree level individuals making a couple $1,000s a month, which is a very high salary for Ukraine, they are against it. And in the best way, if you ask the question in a very carefully crafted way, the best you're going to get is about 30% of the population is going to support land privatization. There's reasons for that, which are understandable, of course, but now is the time, actually, in a period of crisis, now is the time to just, take the castor oil, like the old Tom and Jerry cartoons, take the castor oil, it's going to get worse before it gets better, but you're going to have to get it done, because that's what's going to bring the economy back. They have not been able to figure out why this is a good deal. They don't trust the system. They think the rich are going to get richer, that they're somehow going to lose their land, even though they have the right to buy and sell it, which they don't have fully right now. So now's the time to do it. I always tell people, times of crisis and change are the times that you need to make the most radical changes. I always say, for example, during the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln didn't say, I'm going to wait till after the war to free the slaves. No, he said, now it's a time of crisis and radical change. So now's the time to make those big societal changes, and that's what will make a difference long term for Ukraine. One interesting thing, though, and this might be interesting for those listening, there's been some talk about anti-malaria medicines being effective against the COVID-19 virus. The interesting thing is, if you try to find those medicines now at pharmacies in Ukraine, that seems to be the one item which most pharmacies are now out of stock of, which is very unfortunate, because those who suffer from rheumatological diseases, they actually need that medicine. Those who suffer from lupus, for example, those medicines are quite effective in treating those diseases. And now there seems to be a shortage on the market because there is hoarding of certain medicines which are believed to have some effect and some protection against the virus, although that's not been proven by the food, by the CDC or others yet. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks. Always good to talk to you.